Hi, everyone. This is Wade Franson. Welcome to the sneak peek for episode 139, airing February 25th, with a special guest who comes from the island nation of Trinidad. Now, I've worked with this guest sort of over a few years now because she published a short story with Something or Other Publishing, and only learned in the last couple of months that she also wrote a book for those who are on a spiritual path. And I had to get her to agree to show up on this show. Welcome to the studio, Celine.
Thank you so much for having me, Wade.
And thank you for being here. Everyone's going to just love your delightful accent for one thing. But in addition to that, you wrote your book when you were about 22, if I get that correct. So tell me about the circumstances and the nature of that book.
So I had just started my first degree in university. I was doing geomatics engineering. And I did about a year and a half of it when I realized that this wasn't for me. And I felt like the Lord was leading me out of the university. So I dropped out. And at that time I was going to church, and I noticed that a lot of young people were leaving the church. And these were people that were on fire for God. They came in on fire for God. They were at, all the conventions, they were at everything, involved in everything in the church. And then all of a sudden they just kind of lost interest and they left the church. And I was really heartbroken by that. And I started to do some investigating. And I realized that they were leaving the church because sometimes they weren't being addressed with certain things. And sometimes because they were young, people were telling them that they weren't old enough to understand, or they were not well seasoned enough to understand certain concepts. And I think that the gospel was a little complicated. Sometimes we make it a little complicated, and I wanted to write something about that. So it started off as a vent first as to why the youths were leaving. And then eventually I started to talk about how you walk with God and actually give advice on a casual level. So the book is written totally casually. And it was just my message to help new Christians be able to understand the gospel in a simple way, but also to understand the things that they don't usually tell new Christians, which is why the book is called Things That They Don't Tell New Christians.
Wonderful. And in the studio, when we were talking before, you shared with me the powerful, dramatic events that led you to your own deep spiritual connection, which we're not going to reveal here on this sneak peek. You're going to have to come to the full show to learn about the amazing story that Celine has to tell that led to all this. But I want to ask one more question about what you just said, that sometimes the gospel is made too complicated, because we talked about that in the studio, and your book sought to address that. So unpack just very briefly, what do you mean the gospel is being made more complicated than it needs to be, more complicated than is useful, and perhaps why youth are being dismissed and discouraged with the, oh, you're too young to understand kind of talk?
So I think that it has a lot to do with tradition mixing into doctrine. And there's a lot of tradition in the church that, stipulates these rules. And it's almost like the law. And it's kind of hard because you're trying to fulfill these expectations and you're not living up to these expectations. So you just kind of be honest with yourself and you're like, well, I can't do this anymore. So I think that was one of the major things. And then another thing is that sometimes we make it too complex. We add all these big words and we use theology. I'm not saying that theology is bad, but, it kind of loses the message and the simplicity of the gospel. The gospel is straightforward. It's not meant to be that, a winding road.
Thank you. I can already anticipate several questions that will come out of that we will unpack, such as the fact that, in Jesus' day, he fought against the traditions that had crept into the Jewish religion, and he cut through them like through the Gordian knot. And I can't wait to talk about that directly with you in the studio, and many other things. So for a full hour of Celine Elizabeth and unpacking her book and the message of it, you do not want to miss episode 139, airing on February 25th at 8 p.m. Central Time on Created in the Image of God. See you there.